15. The plane landed in Bangkok. 470 doctors, intellectuals, reporters made their way to the large Berlin of an international hotel where more doctors, actors, singers, professors of linguistics had gathered, with several hundred journalists bearing notebooks, tape recorders, and cameras still in video. On the podium, a group of 20 or so Americans sitting on a long table were presiding over the proceedings. The French intellectuals with whom France had entered the ballroom felt slighted and humiliated. The march on Cambodia had been their idea, and here the Americans, supremely unabashed as usual, had not only taken over, but had taken over in English without a second thought. That a Dane or Frenchman might not understand them, and because Danes had long since forgotten that they had once formed a nation of their own, the French were the only Europeans capable of protest. So high were their principles that they refused to protest in English and made their case to the Americans on the podium of their mother tongue. The Americans, not understanding a word, reacted with friendly, agreeing smiles. In the end, the French had no choice but to frame their objection in English. Why is this meeting in English when the Frenchmen are present? Though amazed at so curious an objection, the Americans, still smiling, acquiesced. The meeting would be run bilingually. Before it would resume, however, a suitable interpreter had to be found. Every sentence had to be resound in both English and in French, which made the discussion twice as long, or rather more than twice as long, since all the French had some English and kept interrupting the interpreter to correct him, disputing every word. The meeting reached its peak when a famous American actress rose to speak. Because of her, even more photographers and cameramen streamed into the auditorium. Every syllable she pronounced was accompanied by a click of another camera. The actress spoke about suffering children, about the banal barbarity of the communist dictatorship, the human right to security, and the current threat to the traditional values of civilized society, and inalienable freedom of the human individual. And the President Carter, who was deeply sorrowed by the events in Cambodia, by the time she pronounced the closing words, she was in tears. Then up jumped the French doctor with a red mustache and shouted, "We're here to cure the dying people, not to pay homage to the President Carter. Let's not turn this into an American propaganda circus. We're not here to protest against communism. We're here to save lives." He was immediately seconded by several other Frenchmen. The interpreter was frightened and did not dare translate what they said, so the 20 Americans on the podium looked once more with smiles full of goodwill, many nodding agreement. One of them even lifted his fist in the air because he knew Europeans like to raise their fists in times of collective euphoria. 16. How can it be that leftist intellectuals, because the doctor with the mustache was nothing if not a leftist intellectual, are willing to march against the interests of a communist country when communism has always been considered a left's domain? When the crimes of the country called the Soviet Union became scandalous, a leftist had two choices: either to split on his former life and stop marching, or more or less sheepishly to reclassify the Soviet Union as an obstacle to the Grand March and march on. Have I not said what makes a leftist is the kitsch of the Grand March? The identity of kitsch comes not from political strategies, but from images, metaphors, and vocabulary. Is it therefore possible to break the habit of march against the interests of the communist country? What is possible, however, is to substitute one word for the others. It is possible to threaten the Vietnamese army for one's fist. It is impossible to shout, "Down with communism, down with communism," is a slogan belonging to the enemies of the Grand March, and anyone worried about losing face must remain faithful to the purity of his own kitsch. The only reason I bring all this up is to explain the misunderstanding between the French doctor and the American actress, who, egocentric as she was, imagined herself the victim of envy or misogyny. In point of fact, the French doctor displayed a finely honed aesthetic sensibility. The phrases "President Carter" and "our traditional values," the barbarity of communism, all belong to the vocabulary of American kitsch and have nothing to do with the kitsch of the Grand March. 17. The next morning they all boarded buses and rode through Thailand into the Cambodian border. In the evening they pulled into a small village where they rented several houses on stilts. The regularly flooding rubber forced the villagers to live above ground level, with their pigs huddled down below. Franz slept in a room with 4 other professors. From far came the oinking of a swine, from up close the snores of a famous mathematician. In the morning they all climbed back into the buses. At a point a mile from the border, all vehicular traffic was prohibited. The border crossing could be reached only by means of narrow, heavily guarded road. The buses stopped. The French contingent poured out of them only to find that again the Americans had beaten them and formed the of the parade. The crucial moment had come. The interpreter was recalled, and a long quarrel ensued. At least everyone absented to the following. The parade would be handed by one of the American, one a Frenchman, and Cambodian interpreter. Next would come the doctors, and only then the rest of the crowd. The American actress brought up the rear. The road was narrow and lined with minefields. Every so often it narrowed down even more by the very 2 cement blocks would round with barbed wire, possible only a single file. About 15 feet ahead of Franz was famous German poet and pop singer who had already written 930 songs of peace against the war. He was carrying a long tape pole topped by a white flag, and set off his full black beard, and set him apart from all the others. All up and down the long parade, photographers and cameramen were snapping and whirring their equipment, dashing up to the front, pausing, inching back, dropping to their knees, and straightening up and running even further ahead. Now even then they would call out the name of some celebrity who would then unwittingly turn their direction just long enough to let them trigger their shutters. 18-something was in the air. People were slowing down and looking back. The American actress who had ended up in the rear could no longer stand the disgrace of it, and determined to take the offensive was sprinting to the head of the parade. It was as if a runner in a 5-kilometer race had been saving his strength by hanging back of the pack. Had suddenly sprung forward and started overtaking his opponents one by one. The men stepped back with embarrassed smiles, not wishing to spoil the famous runner's bid for victory, but the women yelled, "Get back in line, there is no star parade." Undaunted, the actors pushed on, a suite of 5 photographers with camera in tow. Suddenly a Frenchwoman, a professor of linguistics, grabbed the actress by the wrist and said in terrible-sounding English, "This is a parade for doctors who have come to care for the mortally ill Cambodians, not a publicity stunt for movie stars." The actress' wrist was locked in the linguistic professor's grip. She could do nothing to pry it loose. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she said in perfect English. "I've been in hundreds of parades like this. You won't get anywhere without stars. It's our job, our moral obligation." "Merde," said the linguistics professor in perfect French. The American actress understood and burst into tears. "Hold it, please," a cameraman called out, and knelt at her feet. The actress gave a long look into his lens, and tears flowing down her cheeks. 19. When at last the linguistic professor let go of the American actress's wrist, the German hop sinker with the black beard and white flag called out her name. The American actress had never heard of him, but after being humiliated, she was more receptive to sympathy than usual, and ran over to him. The singer switched his pole to his left hand and put his arms around his shoulders. There they were, immediately surrounded by new photographers and cameramen. A well-known American photographer, having trouble squeezing both their faces and the flag into his viewfinder because the pole was so long, moved back a few steps into the rice field, and so it happened that he stepped on a mine. An explosion rang out, and his body ripped to pieces. When flying through the air, a raining shower of blood of the European intellectuals, the singer and the actress were horrified and could not budge. They lifted their eyes to the flag. It was splattered with blood. Once more they were horrified. Then they timidly ventured a few more looks upward, began to smile slightly. They were filled with a strange pride, a pride they had never known before. The flag they were carrying had been consecrated by blood. Once more they joined the march. 20. The border was formed by a small river, but because a long wall, 6 feet high and lined with sandbags to protect, Thai sharpshooters ran alongside it, was invisible. There was only one breach in the wall. At the point where a bridge spanned the river, Vietnamese forces lay in wait on the other side, but they were invisible. Both positions were perfectly camouflaged. It was clear, however, that the moment anyone set foot on the bridge, the invisible Vietnamese would open fire. The parade participants went up to the wall and stood on tiptoe. Franz peered in the gap between the two sandbags, trying to see what was going on. He saw nothing. Then he saw he was shoved away by the photographer, who felt that he had no more right to the space. Franz looked back. 7 photographers were perching in the mighty crown of the isolated tree, like a flock of overgrown cows, their eyes fixed on the opposite bank. Just then the interpreter at the head of the parade raised a large megaphone to her lips and called out the Khmer on the other side. "These people are doctors. They request permission to enter the territory of Cambodia and offer medical assistance, and they have no political designs whatsoever and are guided solely by a concern for human life." The response from the other side was a stunning silence, a silence so absolute that everyone's spirits sank. While the cameras clicked on, sounding in the silence like the song of an exotic insect, Franz had the sudden feeling that the Grand March was coming to an end. Europe was surrounded by borders of silence, and the space where the Grand March was occurring was now no more than a small platform in the middle of a planet. The crowds that had once pressed eagerly up to the platform had long since departed, and the Grand March went on in solitude without spectators. "Yes," said Franz to himself, "the Grand March goes on, the world's indifference notwithstanding, but it is growing nervous and hectic. Yesterday against the American occupation of Vietnam, today against the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, yesterday for Israel, today for the Palestinians, yesterday for Cuba, tomorrow against Cuba, and always against America, at times against massacres, and at times in support of other massacres. Europe marches on, and to keep up with the events, to leave none of them out, its pace grows faster and faster, until finally the Grand March is a procession of rushing, galloping people, and the platform is shrinking and shrinking, until one day it will be reduced to a mere dimensionless dot." 21. Once more the interpreter shouted her challenge into the megaphone, and again the response was a boundless and endlessly indifferent silence. Franz looked in all directions. The silence on the other side of the river had hit them all like a slap in the face. Even the singer with the white flag and the American actress were depressed, hesitant about what to do next. In a flash of insight, Franz saw how laughable they all were, but instead of cutting him off from them and flooding him with irony, the thought made him feel the kind of infinite love we feel for the condemned. Yes, the Grand March was coming to an end, but was that any reason for Franz to betray it? Wasn't his own life coming to an end as well? Who was he to jeer at the exhibitionism of the people accompanying the courageous doctors to the border? What could they all do but put on a show? Had they any choice? Yeah. Franz was right. I couldn't help thinking about the editor in Prague who organized a petition for the amnesty of political prisoners. He knew perfectly well that his petition would not help the prisoners. His true goal was not to free the prisoners, it was to show people without fear still exists. That too is play acting. But he had no other possibility. His choice was not between play acting and acting. His choice was between play acting and no action at all. There are situations in which people are condemned to play act. Their struggle with mute power, the mute power across the river, a police transmogrified into mute microphones on the wall, is the struggle of a theater company that has attacked an army. Franz watched his friend on the Sorbonne lift his fist and threaten silence on the other side. 22. For the third time, the interpreter shouted her challenge into the microphone. The silence she again received in response suddenly turned Franz's depression into rage. Here he was, standing only a few steps from the bridge, joining Thailand and Cambodia, and he felt an overwhelming desire to run out into it, scream blood-curdling curses to the skies, and die in a great clatter of gunfire. The sudden desire, Franz reminds us of something. Yes, it reminds us of Stalin's son, who ran to electrocute himself on the barbed wire when he could no longer stand to watch the poles of human existence come so close to each other as to touch, where there were no longer any difference between sublime and squalid, angel and fly, God and crap. Franz could not accept the fact that the glory of the Grand March was equal to the comic vanity of its marchers, that the exquisite noise of European history was lost in an infinite silence, and there was no longer any difference between history and silence. He felt like placing his own life on the scales. He wanted to prove that the Grand March weighed more than crap. But man can prove nothing of the sort. One pan of the scales held crap, the other Stalin's son put his entire body, and the scales did not move. Instead of getting himself shot, Franz merely hung his head and went back with the others single file to the buses.